Of Shadows and Saints, a short horror story, written by Michael van der Voort, narrated by Robin Reads. I have to say that, for me, Lent was always the worst. Admittedly, it wasn't until I hit my late teens that I began to realize just how decadently gothic, how intricately laced with a mix of melodrama and melancholy the whole Catholicism thing actually was, but Lent was still the worst. Or at least, it was in my parish. In the town where I was brought up, and in the church where I spent my Sundays, Catholicism was about as Gothic could be. Especially during Lent. During Lent, I would go to church almost every night, all those dim, candle-lit evenings swirling with shadows and redolent with history, ritual and tradition, the golds and reds of ornamental splendor and all those stone-skinned saints with their alabaster features and fixed marble stairs glaring down in silent judgment. I remember the smell of the dark mahogany wood, austere pews, polished smooth by centuries of touch, yet still giving off that sense of detached solidity, as if no matter how often you bent to their hard, uncomfortable kneelers, you would somehow never be worthy. Then there were the colours. Straight from the Gothic palette, everything splashed with the richest of ruby crimsons, the most lustrous gold, and the creamy off-white pallor of the lately and newly dead. But still, Lent was always worst. For those who don't know, Lent is the period in the Christian calendar leading up to Easter. It runs from Ash Wednesday, when the faithful literally have ashes swiped with a thumbprint onto their foreheads, until Easter Sunday, the holiest day in the Christian calendar, when we celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Lent, which lasts for 40 days, is a time of reflection, penance, and denial. In fact, it's the abstinence that gives most non-Catholics their first encounter with the concept of Lent, usually when they overhear that a colleague isn't drinking or indulging in the office cake at break time because they've given it up for Lent, and indeed, that is a part of it. Basically, in preparation for Easter, many Catholics choose to give up or abstain from something for the full 40 days. I was never very good at that, and remember once joking that for Lent that year I was giving things up. A joke almost as offensive as my later claim to have given up Christianity for Lent, though, of course, that one was never quite true. That notion of abstinence, denial, and temperance, however, does not end with these small acts of self-prohibition, and people deciding not to eat chocolate for 40 days. Rather, it bleeds into and permeates every church and service, filling those 40 days with an atmosphere of serious, sorrowful despondency. Despite the fact that Good Friday, the day Jesus died, comes right at the tail end of Lent, the entire 40 days felt to me like a period of mourning, like one long funeral that lasts over a month. In some ways, it is an effective technique. Though the date of Easter is not fixed to coincide with the changing of seasons, in England, the passing from winter into spring is certainly something that churches exploit for dramatic effect. The impact of this coincidence is that much of the Lenten period, where services such as confession or the Stations of the Cross are celebrated in the evening, always seem to be in the cold and the dark. The season itself lends its weight to the melancholy of the situation. By contrast, the Easter Sunday Mass held at the end of Lent takes place in the pale, radiant sunlight of a spring morning. The impact of this contrast can't be overstated. Coming to Mass on Easter Sunday, for the faithful, does feel like a fresh start, a new resurrected beginning, when all the things that are not allowed in the church during Lent are once again fully on display. Easter feels like a celebration. Lent feels like death. To give some examples of how pared back and muted churches are during Lent, and give you an idea of why I always hated it, flowers are banned. Where there would usually be large, beautiful arrangements on the altar, in the entranceway, or as a centerpiece, in Lent those spaces, those vases, are left bare. There is no music, The hymns sung by the choir over the reedy tone of the organ are silenced during Lent, so that the already somewhat sombre atmosphere of a Catholic church becomes all the more mournful. And worst of all for me, as a child and even as a teenager, the statues of the saints are covered. Usually, every pillar and cornice of a Catholic church would have a small plinth on which a statue of a saint would reside. Whilst I had never been a fan of those waxy-featured effigies, many would take great comfort from praying before their beneficent gaze. So often had I visited our local church as a child that I could easily have told you which saints were positioned where, and how you could tell just by looking at them which holy man or woman they were supposed to be. There was St. Anthony with the cherubic child Jesus standing on his open book, St. Peter clutching the keys to the gates of heaven in his hand, and of course the Virgin Mary, a vision of beauty, dressed in tones of pale blue and white that seemed all the more pure against the flood of darker, more menacing shades that surrounded her. During Lent, however, it was all menacing, and the statues could not be seen. In a tradition I never really understood the meaning of, the statues of saints would be covered over during Lent, each and every figurine draped in a thick purple sheet. This cloth, which always made me think of a burial shroud, would be placed over the statue so that it rested on the crown of the head and fell away on every side, making the saint eventually look like one of those cartoon ghosts that is basically just a bedsheet that mimics roughly the outline of a person. As a child, I remember the long hours spent in the freezing echoes of that building, and how those strange purple ghosts on either side of the aisle would send shivers down my spine. I knew it was wrong to feel that way. That under the sheets were saints, the holiest of holy people, and that to be scared of these strange mounds of purple cloth, especially inside a church, in God's house, was probably somehow sacrilegious. And yet I couldn't help it. It wasn't the saints themselves that scared me, but the shape the statues made when covered. Sometimes, in the glassy chill of the late English winter, during evening prayers or whilst waiting to go in for confession, alone in the freezing echoes of that building, I would glance up at those shrouded figures and return the stares I could no longer see. I would observe them, high on their plinths and covered over with the purple of penance and sacrifice, and would begin to imagine, to wonder what I would do if one of them, from under that hanging garment, happened to raise an arm. If I saw from my kneeling crouch in the pews a twitch of the slightest movement. Those shrouded figures haunted me, and I thought about them often, mulling the image over and over in my mind, torturing myself with questions. Like, what would I do if I were to wake one night and find such a vision, a rough approximation of a person, covered over in cloth, standing silently at the end of my bed? No eyes, no mouth, nor even a face to speak of. Just the bulbous dome of a head hidden under fabric, the gentle downward slope of a shape suggestive of shoulders, a shrouded thing, standing in silence. It's an idea that still sometimes creeps up on me now, though, of course, I have more reason to be fearful than most. For much of my youth, at least from the age of around 9 years, I served as an altar boy at St. Dunstan's Catholic Church. What this meant was that each week, and often several times a week, I would turn up to church before the service started, put on a special robe, and, along with a small handful of other boys, would assist the priest during Mass. In reality, this might involve finding the correct page for the readings, carrying plates, chalices, and ciborium back and forth during the blessing of the Eucharist, and, my favourite, ringing the handheld bells when the priest raised the host. As a boy, and even later as an adolescent, the service on the altar was as much a part of my faith as it was a job. I took the whole thing very seriously and paid careful attention to every word of the Mass, as if I was likely to be quizzed on the intricate details later. Eventually, when Father Dean arrived, that was exactly what happened. Following each Mass, we would be led into the sacristy, the priest's living quarters, where we got changed and where the priest would prepare the instruments for the Mass. We would line up in front of the old priest and he would play a game with us, in which he would ask a question about the service. The question could pertain to that morning's reading, a particular saint, or some other, more obscure aspect of theology. The first of us to raise our hand and answer correctly would be rewarded with a shilling. Predictably enough, however, the more jovial aspect of the practice was also put on hold during Lent. As time went on, however, my fellow altar boys and I started to realize that a single shilling wasn't going to cut it in the real world, and our desperate clamor to find the correct answer faded around the same time that our interest in other forms of income from being on the altar began to rise. Once the older altar boys left, going off to university or deciding they had elsewhere to be on a Sunday morning, we younger acolytes were promoted into more prominent and visible positions on the altar and during special ceremonies. It was during the latter that we came to realize that our newfound visibility could be a money spinner, and that perhaps we could gain a reward for our service that was a little more immediate than the promise of salvation. It turned out that, for as long as they had been the head altar boys, our predecessors had been receiving donations or gifts from grateful participants in sacramental masses. These backhanded payments, which were essentially the equivalent of tips given by worshippers as a reward for the altar boys helping with the Mass, varied considerably in size and generosity, from a couple of chocolate bars all the way up to bona fide proper money. And it was the prospect of this that made us fight over the different masses scheduled that week. Funerals were always best. Whilst you might presume that weddings, confirmations, or baptisms, as celebratory occasions where people are typically in a joyful mood, might be most lucrative, this was not actually the case. On those occasions, the people likely to offer a tip were typically distracted. Being wrapped up in all that joy led them to wrap up their wallets and be swept along with the many organizational obligations of the day. As they reveled in the joy of each other, people forgot about those outside of their circle. Funerals, on the other hand, were the opposite. My grandfather always used to say that you never meet a poor undertaker. Not only do they have a job for life, with the comfort of knowing they will never be short of clients, but by dealing with people who are in the midst of being chewed by the brutal fangs of grief, existing in a stunned, half-quilted stupor of loss, the undertakers are free to wantonly overcharge. Not only that, but they are almost guaranteed to be gratuitously thanked for doing so. It's a horrible thing to say, but the wounded, vulnerable, and grieving tend not to focus on what they are spending because they just want things done, and done quickly, no matter the cost. I have known more than a few unscrupulous barmen in my time who, over the course of the evening, would slowly hike the prices of drinks at a wake, safe in the knowledge that the drinkers would not complain or even notice. They would, in fact, pay virtually anything at that moment, as long as they got a drink. Perhaps it was the reminder of their own mortality that led people to momentarily see how unimportant money was and become unconcerned by its sudden disappearance. But whatever the case, it was definitely true. As one of my fellow altar boys used to say, the greater the number of tears, the looser the purse strings. As an altar boy, all you had to do to make a few quid at a funeral was look suitably mournful and sad whilst carrying the crosses or delivering communion. If it rained at the graveside, all the better. Then you could ensure that the hair plastered to your reddening cheeks appeared suitably picturesque, your service, despite the elements, both stoic and valiant. Rain was good, because getting damp meant you could also get paid for heroically braving the weather and enduring the cold. If you could manage to make your eyes fill with tears, meanwhile, perhaps by failing to blink for a minute or two, then you were guaranteed to have at least a shilling slipped into your hand by a mourner at the end of the whole proceeding. Grief, it seemed, had its own economics. For quite some time when I was a teenager, us altar boys would jockey for an advantage in these sacrament bookings, trying to get our names down for as many funerals as possible, whilst attempting to avoid the tight-fisted baptisms and confirmations. Of course, the cynicism involved in these arrangements did leave me a gnawing sense of guilt, and more than once I thought of actually confessing what we were doing to the priest. I didn't. But then, in deciding not to, I only made the problem worse, and would often exist in a state of perpetual dread of the retribution that would surely come my way. It was at times like these that I hated the statues of saints the most. Perhaps it was the fact that they were statues, that their eyes, relentlessly unblinking, seemed to see and know everything, their gaze penetrating through your words, excuses, and flesh to see what was in your soul. Then again, perhaps not, because the guilt they managed to create was always worse during Lent, when their covered eyes were no longer even visible, and yet their stares could still be felt. Once or twice, in the silence and chill of that great old building, in the flickering dance of the votive candles, I had fooled myself into thinking I had seen a saint move. Caught from just the corner of my eye, I had seen the faint hint of a purple sheet raising slightly at the corner. I knew it wasn't true, that it was a trick of the light, an illusion caused by the creeping dark and the movement of the flames. But still, the very thought, filled me with dread. I would try to stay, to fix my eyes on the small red lamp above the confessional box, waiting my turn to go in, to face the grill between me and the priest, between me and God, where I was meant to confess my sins. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been a week since my last confession." But I couldn't. Again and again my eyes would be pulled back to one of those draped figures, to the edges of the fabric, swaying ever so slightly. Scared by the thought, I would completely abandon my plan to confess and instead retreat from the church altogether. The following day, however, I would turn up for a funeral. I would turn up, knowing full well how insincere I was being, how disingenuous and how greedily exploitative. Yet I would still go. "Lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil." That was until the day of the purse. We had stood as a group by the graveside of some old bloke who'd passed away, whilst the ground was thick with snow. No doubt, seen from above, with the red lapels and our cream-coloured vestments, we would have looked like a handful of berries scattered upon the snow, or else droplets of blood. I recall clearly looking down at the hole into which the coffin was set to be laid and noting how, despite the cold and the layered crystalline purity of the snow all around, it remained immaculately and implacably dark. So dark, open and cavernous, that to me it looked almost like a mouth. I imagined it stretching and yawning open to encompass not only that small rectangular plot, but the whole graveyard, the whole town, opening up like the maw of some great beast to eventually swallow us all. I shuddered visibly as it dawned on me that some day, eventually, it would. As I shuddered, so did the others. Not because of some macabre reflection, but because they realized that by shivering, by accentuating just how cold and hostile the environment was, that they, out of faith and duty, had chosen to brave, they were increasing the value of their stock and making themselves appear more earnest and deserving of a reward. We milked that day for all it was worth. One of the old women by the graveside, presumably the wife of the lately departed, saw us there, wet-haired and shivering, and felt compelled to offer some compensation for our efforts. With a bow of her head and a secretive handshake technique known only to grandmothers and drug dealers, she deftly slipped a crown into each of our palms before departing, to no doubt weep on a bed that, without the warmth of another, would be as cold as that hardened ground. I watched, as she departed, the distinct outline of a woman blurring until it receded to a black speck on the horizon. Then, turning back toward the grave, I saw another black speck, like a dark lump of coal. Bending down to investigate, I saw that the speck was actually a small leather pouch. A purse that clinked and jingled, pleasingly heavy, as I lifted it. For a moment I considered shouting after the old woman, or perhaps handing it over to Father Wright. I also considered sharing the contents with the other boys. Instead, I slipped it through a hole in my cassock and into my pocket. No sooner had I done this than I was startled by a voice at my elbow. Another boy, overjoyed with his prize, whispering to me softly, "Won't be long till we're back here for her. They never last long once one goes." I couldn't help thinking that my friend was probably right. On the way home I thought of that week's reading, of Christ speaking to Peter and proclaiming, "Get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offence unto me, for thou savourest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." I had always hated the image those words conjured for me, and particularly that phrase, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Trudging alone through the snow, racing the fading light, I tried hard not to imagine anything behind me, though my head filled with images of two sets of footprints trailing through the snow, one set made by me, and the other by a thing with hooves. That night, safely back at home, I was unable to sleep. Before turning out the light, I had opened up the tiny coin purse and counted its contents. The money was all in coins and all in silver crowns. There were exactly 30 of them. After tossing and turning for several hours, I eventually got out of bed and decided to pray about what I'd done. Usually I only prayed at church, but this time I took the admittedly melodramatic step of actually getting out of bed and kneeling beside it, like something from a painting or a vintage postcard. I placed my palms together and recited some well-worn prayers, the words tumbling from my lips unregarded. I wasn't really saying the prayers as such. I never dwelt on the words or their meanings, and they escaped my mouth on autopilot, without a thought for what I was actually saying. But that didn't matter. The point was that, whilst these mumblings went on, my mind was occupied, snagged on the thought of that afternoon and what I had done. Having finished my prayers, I decided, for whatever reason, to pad, barefoot and freezing, over to the window. Outside, I knew there would be that heavy, secretive silence of the kind that only comes with snow. Though, as I pulled back the curtain, it was my insides that turned to ice. For there, across the road, coated slightly by the thin layer of still falling snow, standing and silently waiting, was a figure. The figure of a man, draped in a long purple sheet. I reeled back from the window, moving with such speed that I tumbled heavily backwards and woke my mother, who flipped on the light in her room, called to me from the end of the landing, then told me to get back into bed. Rising slowly to my feet, my mouth dry and the breath catching sharp and angular in my throat, I peered over the window ledge and saw, standing opposite, that same awful shape, and realized at once my own stupid mistake. It was a motorbike, facing towards me with a stretch of dark blue tarpaulin pulled over it. The rider had obviously left his helmet on top of the handlebars before throwing the sheet over it, so that from the front, seen from my bedroom window, the helmet formed the shape of head and the handlebars the shoulders. I tried, upon realizing my mistake, to laugh, to shrug off my stupidity and laugh at it. But I couldn't. Instead, I wrapped myself in a blanket, sat up in bed, and waited for morning. Knowing in the English winter that the sun would bring neither light nor warmth to the horizon until later, I waited until 5:30 a.m. and then climbed silently out of bed. Dressing hurriedly, I crept slowly down the stairs, threw on my coat and stuffed the coin purse into my pocket before closing the door behind me with as little sound as possible. Making my way back to the church, in the still, dark hush of the morning, was about as lonely as I have ever felt in my life. Still, I knew where I had to go and what I had to do. Arriving at the church, which in those days was left open all night, I heaved back the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer area, checking to ensure there was no one else around. Even at this time of the morning, the church smelled of burnt-out candles and incense. This being Lent, there was no scent of flowers, and I could see, through the stained glass inlay of the second set of doors, that not a single candle was burning inside. It would be cold in there, and horribly dark, yet I knew I had to go in. Dipping my fingers into the freezing holy water, I crossed myself quickly, then tugged back the door to the main church. Stepping through, I could not help but release the door and send it swinging back with a hideous, echoing bang. I had lost my grip because my hands, like the rest of my body, had turned entirely to liquid. As I stared into the space, I saw that, despite the early hour, the pews were full, though not with praying parishioners. In every pew, facing towards the altar, were the clearly visible shapes of figures in purple shrouds. On either side of the aisle, occupying seats, their heads reduced to gently rounded lumps, shoulders sloping gormlessly away and smoothed to a pyramid by a falling drape of fabric, they waited. Dozens, if not scores of figures, waiting in situ, for me. I tried to scream, tried in vain to call out, to beg for help or forgiveness, but no sound came. Instead, I was cursed to remain silent, watching as these robed beings rested in silent prayer, looking away but knowing, each of them knowing, what I had done and why I was there. I looked from one to the other, tracing lines of ill-formed shape, then pulled my eyes away. I searched for every plinth, every nook and cranny of the place that had until then housed a saint, and saw only empty space. Every one was vacant, every niche was bare. The saints no longer stood, hidden in their shrouds, to look down upon me. Now they sat and waited, uniformly hooded, in looming presence and threat. I almost ran. For a moment, as the movement and feeling came back to my limbs, I thought of sprinting away, but as the copper taste of fear flooded into my mouth, I was reminded again of the silver coins, heavy in my pocket, and so, instead, I bowed, genuflecting before the altar, and in slow, cautious steps made my way toward it. Though the aisle toward the altar wasn't all that long, that slow procession seemed to me to take hours. With every careful step, I kept my eyes fixed on the altar, never wanting to let my gaze drift to those silent watchers seated on either side. I tried my best to be blinkered, to stare straight ahead and ignore the shapes on the edge of my vision, even as the very weight of their presence pressed down upon me. With every step forward, I thought again and again of the cold touch of marble, of alabaster hands with long tapered fingers pressing on the flesh with a touch as hard and cold as death. I pictured those hands, some with cracks and paint, the textured skin of a leper, others smooth as the inside of a shell, so pure it was almost worse. On and on I paced, past these awful shapes, until finally I reached the base of the altar and, plunging my hand into my pocket, tears of terror and remorse in my eyes, placed the purse on the bottom step and left it there, knowing as I did that I would still need to make my way back. Turning with my head bowed, I again tried not to look as my mind filled with purple shrouds and with what might lie below. Now I did not see only statues of marble and of stone, but real, fleshly saints, their martyrdom apparent. I thought of the purple fabric stuck to drying wounds, of huge crimson stains growing like ink on blotting paper into the fabric of the shrouds, of St. Stephen brutally stoned to death, Sebastian strung up and shot with arrows. I thought of Catherine broken on the wheel and felt my throat growing tighter and tighter. Raising my head, at last I saw them, the hunched, covered figures, row upon row, stretching back to the end of the church. I saw the aisle that led between, and finally I ran. I did not go back to church for almost a year after that. In the intervening time, I told no one about what had happened. Eventually, though, I cracked. Returning, sorrowfully, like a kicked dog or the prodigal son, to the church, I stepped inside the wooden box, knelt, and made my confession. Afterwards, and after saying my penance, I sat in the pews, those same pews that had a year before been occupied by a host of veiled saints, and told Father Dean not only what I had done, but what had happened that night in the church. Resting his hand on one of my shoulders, he smiled with such a glow of paternal warmth that I almost began to cry. He told me that every year in Holy Week before the Easter Sunday Mass, the statues are taken down from their plinths and are either given a fresh coat of paint and varnish or cleaned and polished so that they look the part on the big day. "I can only imagine," he said with a broad, knowing smile, "that the verger took them down and placed them in the pews ready for cleaning the next day. I'm sure they must have given you quite the fright, but there really is nothing to be scared of." He laughed, and again seemed to fill the space with an almost tangible warmth. "This is a house of God. You don't have to worry here." He then got up, excused himself, and disappeared to prepare for Mass. Initially, I was reassured by Father Dean's words and by the fact that I had finally confessed to what I did. There was no doubt that I felt somehow lighter afterwards. The feeling, however, lasted only a moment. On my way out of the church, I happened to glance down and saw, just outside the door, a small leather purse resting on the step. It had not been there on my way into the church. I was certain of it, and there seemed to be no one around who might have chosen to leave it there. What was inside I will never know. That time I decided to ignore it. I still go to church quite often, though I choose to pray at home in the run-up to Easter or whenever the statues are covered. My parish priest knows my reasons and has given me his blessing. Amongst other things, for 40 days each year, I give up church for Lent. This has been Of Shadows and Saints, a short horror story, written by Michael van der Voort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2023 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.